Prepare to be terrified with these 3 truly disturbing winter horror stories. Story 1: The Thing in the Snow. They say winter nights can hush the world, but on this night, the silence felt alive, watching, waiting. I used to adore the Montana wilderness in winter. There's a calming stillness when the snowfall blankets everything, muting the distant hum of civilization. My cabin, tucked miles away from the closest neighbor, was my personal haven. But all that serenity shattered one January evening when a creeping sense of unease clawed its way into my bones, like the storm itself had a heartbeat and it was pounding at my door. The wind had howled all day, rattling the shutters and piling drifts halfway up the windows. By twilight, that howling abruptly died. It was unsettling, as though even nature feared to make a sound. I flipped on the porch light out of habit, scanning the endless white. That's when I noticed them. Footprints in the freshly fallen snow, trailing from the darkness of the tree line straight up to my back door. My own prints from earlier in the day had long been buried under new layers of powder, so these were recent. I had to force myself to breathe. I approached the window and pressed my forehead to the glass, squinting through the soft glow. The footprints were deep, uneven, like something had dragged a foot with each step. Curiosity battled with dread in my mind. A lost hiker, an injured wanderer? Yet the sinking feeling in my gut told me no, whoever made those prints hadn't moved normally, and why come to my door without knocking? Then, out of nowhere, a muffled knock rippled through the cabin walls. 3 slow, deliberate taps, like an invitation from the dead. My breath caught in my chest. I strained to see movement outside, but the falling snow devoured all details. Slowly, I fumbled for my phone, each second amplified by the pounding of my heart. A single bar of signal flickered. I called the sheriff's office, ignoring the voice in my head that asked, "What if it's already inside?" The phone rang twice before static crackled. I barely heard the dispatcher say, "Hello," when the power cut out, plunging me into blackness. My phone screen glowed faintly, reflecting my own terrified eyes. The heater's hum died, and the quiet that replaced it was almost claustrophobic. My next breath felt thick in my lungs, like the air itself had turned cold and heavy. Clicking on my flashlight, I slid off the couch and tiptoed down the hall. The narrow beam revealed swirling dust motes in the gloom. I was trying to reach the breaker panel when I heard a door hinge squeak from the bedroom, metal on metal, slow, as if someone was gently testing the threshold. My knees went weak. How could anyone get in with all the doors locked? A silhouette stood in the doorway, misshapen and hunched, its limbs too long, its frame too still. I wanted to scream, but fear locked my voice in my throat. The figure took a single step forward, and I noticed a dripping sound, like melting icicles hitting the floor. Snow slid off its shoulders, forming a small puddle on the floorboards. Then I heard a ragged inhale, as though it was drawing in the warmth of my presence, feeding on my fear. I staggered backward, the flashlight beam trembling. The thing's face caught the light for a moment, eyes dark as cavities, skin unnaturally pale. Its mouth parted. No words, just a rattling breath that made my stomach tighten. In one desperate motion, I threw my shoulder against the back door, unlatched it, and stumbled out into the blizzard. My boots vanished in waist-deep snow, but adrenaline propelled me forward. I thought I heard a scraping noise behind me, as if it was following in the footprints I left behind. Snow pelted my cheeks and stung my eyes, yet I pressed on until I collapsed at a neighbor's porch, panting, unable to form coherent sentences. When the sheriff finally arrived, they found my cabin empty and locked. No sign of forced entry. The footprints at my back door were there, but they faded after a few yards, swallowed by gusts of powder. Inside, the power had returned on its own. The only oddity, a puddle of half-melted snow in the bedroom near the window. No footprints, no shattered glass. Now, each time the temperature plunges and the snow piles high, I see those uneven footprints in my nightmares. If you ever hear a knock in the hush of winter, don't open the door. Something in that endless white might be waiting to step inside.
Story 2: The Man Who Smiled. He was little more than a silhouette against the whirling snow, but that smile, God, that smile, burned into my mind like a brand. I was driving home for the holidays, an 8-hour trip through miles of frozen, empty highways. Snow fell thick, covering the road, making it harder to see. That's when I spotted him. A man standing by the roadside, barely visible in my headlights. He wore nothing but a thin jacket. No car in sight, no footprints in the snow behind him. Just standing, waiting. I hesitated but stopped a few feet ahead. Rolling down my window just an inch, I called out, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" He didn't move, didn't speak. He just smiled. Not a grateful smile, not a nervous smile. A wide, stretching, too big smile, like he was waiting for something. When I glanced in the mirror again, he was in my back seat. My scream lodged in my throat. My grip tightened on the wheel, my knuckles white as I forced myself to look in the rearview mirror again. The seat was empty. I slammed my foot on the gas, heart hammering as my car fishtailed on the icy road. My breaths came in short gasps, my mind scrambling for an explanation. Had I imagined it? Was the storm playing tricks on me? I drove without stopping for miles, my pulse a drumbeat in my ears. It wasn't until I reached a gas station on the outskirts of town that I finally pulled over. My hands shook as I stepped out, desperate for the cold air to clear my head. The station was deserted except for an old man behind the counter. I walked in, rubbing my arms to shake off the lingering chill. "Long drive?" the man asked, barely looking up from his newspaper. I hesitated. "Yeah, you could say that." He nodded knowingly. "Storm's bad tonight. Dangerous to stop for anyone on the road." Something about the way he said it made my stomach twist. "Why do you say that?" He finally looked at me, his eyes dark and serious. Because sometimes they aren't people. A shiver crawled up my spine. I turned to leave, but then I saw it, faint, foggy fingerprints on the inside of my rear windshield. I never drove alone at night again.
Story 3, Footsteps on the Roof. This next story is a bone-chilling tale that will horrify you. It was a Christmas Eve that now haunts my dreams. You know how snow can make a home feel cozy, unless the crunch of unseen footsteps drags across your roof, reminding you that not all visitors bring cheer. My sister and I always spent Christmas Eve at our family's lodge, a sprawling log home set against a frozen lake. We'd drink cocoa, decorate the tree, and wait for our parents to arrive the next morning. It was a warm tradition in the dead of winter, at least until one year when the warmth was swallowed by a chilling terror neither of us could forget. We weren't alone. The storm that night was relentless, wind howling through the trees like a distant scream. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the wooden walls, but it did little to warm the uneasy feeling creeping over me. My sister sat curled on the couch, wrapped in a thick blanket, her eyes glued to a Christmas movie we had seen 100 times before. But I wasn't watching. I was listening. A sound, faint but distinct, scraping across the roof. It wasn't the wind. It was something heavier. I muted the TV. My sister turned to me, confused. "What?" she asked. "Shh." We listened. Silence. Then from above, a soft but deliberate thud, a slow dragging sound, like something shifting its weight, crawling just above us. My stomach clenched. "Probably a branch," I whispered, more to myself than to her. But I didn't believe it. She didn't either. The scraping resumed, this time closer to the chimney. Then with a sudden jolt, something knocked against the roof vent, hard. My sister grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. We weren't imagining this. I grabbed the poker from the fireplace and crept toward the nearest window, peering out into the swirling snow. The night was dark, the snow reflecting only the dim glow of our porch light. I saw nothing, but then a shadow shifted, just beyond the light's reach. A hand, long, too thin, gripped the edge of the roof. I stumbled back. My sister let out a choked gasp. "What was that?" Before I could answer, the sound above changed. No more dragging, no more scraping. Now it was footsteps. Slow, deliberate, pacing above us. Then, with horrifying certainty, I realized the footsteps weren't leading away. They were heading toward the attic entrance inside the house. A loud thump echoed from the ceiling, the attic hatch shuddering. We ran out the door into the freezing night, snow biting at our bare feet. We sprinted to the car, fumbling with the keys, our breaths coming in panicked gasps. Just as I yanked the driver's side door open, I made the mistake of looking up. A figure stood on the roof, silhouetted against the snow, watching, waiting. The car engine roared to life, and I slammed it into reverse, speeding away from the cabin. The figure jumped off the roof in unholy quickness. It stood in front of the cabin, its long fingers curled, looking like it was waving goodbye. When we returned with the police the next morning, the attic hatch was open. Snow had drifted inside, forming a perfect circle beneath the entrance. There were no footprints leading up to it, no sign of forced entry. But in the frost-covered glass of the upstairs window, one word had been traced by a finger: soon. We never spent another Christmas at the cabin.
3 disturbing, true camping horror stories. Prepare to have your nightmares haunted by these chilling tales. Watch to the end and share in the comments. Story 1, The Midnight Intruders. I used to love camping until that disturbing day where it all changed. I loved being able to get away from it all. I loved the serenity of nature and how the forest comes alive with sounds. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and I used to crave that feeling. I thought it made me stronger, braver. But after my last solo camping trip, I've sworn never to return to the woods. What I experienced out there was beyond fear. It makes my skin crawl even now. I have never been the same. This is the story that keeps me up at night. It was late fall, and I had driven out to a remote campsite in the Appalachian foothills. The road was narrow and winding, with no sign of civilization for miles. That was part of the appeal. I wanted to escape the chaos of city life and clear my head. As I pulled into the clearing, the trees seemed to close in around me, their bare branches reaching like skeletal fingers against the gray sky. It was perfect, or so I thought. After setting up my tent and gathering firewood, I sat by the fire with a mug of coffee, watching the flames dance. The silence was comforting at first, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. But as the hours stretched on, the quiet began to feel oppressive, like the forest was holding its breath. I shook off the unease and told myself I was imagining things. Around midnight, I caught a flicker of light in the distance. My first thought was that it was another camper, but this area was so remote that it seemed unlikely. The light bobbed and swayed, growing brighter as it approached. I turned off my lantern and crouched by the fire in terror, trying to stay hidden. The light stopped about 100 yards away, and I could make out 3 figures wearing headlamps. They stood motionless, staring in the direction of my campsite. My heart was racing, but I stayed as still as I could, hoping they would leave. Instead, they started moving toward me, their steps slow and deliberate. I scrambled back into the shadows, hiding behind a tree as the intruders entered my campsite. They moved with eerie precision, rifling through my belongings and tossing them aside. One of them picked up my hatchet, inspecting it like a butcher sizing up a knife. Another began carving strange symbols into the dirt with a long, curved blade. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. Suddenly, one of them turned and looked directly at the tree I was hiding behind. I held my breath, my heart pounding so loud I was sure they could hear it. The figure whispered something to the others, and they all began to spread out, their headlamps scanning the trees. I knew I had to move. Staying low, I crept away from the campsite, each step feeling like it took an eternity. A branch snapped underfoot, and all 3 headlamps snapped in my direction. They started running toward me. I bolted, adrenaline coursing through my veins as I zigzagged through the forest, trying to throw them off. The beams of their lights danced wildly behind me, growing closer with every step. I ducked behind a large fallen tree, pressing myself against the ground and trying to control my ragged breathing. The headlamps passed by, their beams cutting through the dark like searchlights. I stayed there for what felt like hours, too terrified to move. When I finally mustered the courage to peek out, the forest was silent again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. I didn't need to be told twice. I've never camped again since. Every so often I'll dream of those headlamps, bobbing through the trees, and I'll wake up drenched in sweat. I don't think I'll ever feel safe in the woods again.
When you're miles away from civilization, surrounded by nothing but trees and silence, you expect to feel a sense of peace. That's why my friends and I loved camping. But on one trip, deep in the Idaho wilderness, it all changed. We learned that the silence can be deceiving. Sometimes it's the quietest places that hold the darkest secrets. It was early spring, and my friends Logan, Mia, and I had planned a weekend getaway to Sawtooth Lake. The drive was long, and the hike to the campsite was even longer, but the view was worth it. Crystal clear water surrounded by towering peaks, with not another soul in sight. We set up our tents, built a fire, and spent the evening laughing and swapping stories. Around midnight, the fire had burned low, and we decided to turn in. As I crawled into my sleeping bag, I felt that familiar sense of contentment. But that feeling didn't last long. I woke up to a rustling sound outside my tent. It was faint at first, like leaves being disturbed by the wind, but it grew louder and more deliberate. I sat up, my heart racing. "Logan," I whispered. "Do you hear that?" Before he could answer, Mia's voice cut through the darkness. "There's something out there." We unzipped our tents and shone our flashlights into the trees. The forest was unnervingly still, and the sound had stopped. Logan shrugged it off, but Mia and I were uneasy. We decided to stoke the fire and stay up for a while, just in case. The next morning, we found footprints in the mud near our campsite. They were large and human-like, but the toes were elongated and clawed. Logan joked that it was Bigfoot, but his nervous laugh betrayed him. We couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That night, the noises returned. This time, they were louder and closer. Footsteps circled our campsite, stopping and starting as if whoever, or whatever it was toying with us. We huddled by the fire, too scared to sleep. At one point, I thought I saw a pair of glowing eyes in the darkness, but they vanished before I could be sure. By dawn, we were exhausted but determined to leave. As we packed up, we heard a loud crash, like a tree falling. We grabbed our gear and hiked out as fast as we could. But even as we reached the trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. When I looked back, I caught a glimpse of a shadowy figure disappearing into the trees. It was watching us.
Camping is supposed to be a way to reconnect with nature, to escape the stresses of modern life. That's what I told myself when I took my 15-year-old daughter Lily to the Black Hills of South Dakota last summer. I wanted to bond with her after my divorce, but our trip turned into something I still can't explain. We found a perfect spot in a small clearing surrounded by pines. The first night was uneventful, and I was relieved. Lily and I roasted marshmallows, told jokes, and talked about everything from her favorite books to her plans for the future. It felt good to see her smile again. The second night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside our tent. At first, I thought it was an animal, but the steps were too deliberate, too human. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent. The beam of light revealed nothing but trees and shadows. "Dad, what's wrong?" "It's nothing," I lied. "Go back to sleep." But it wasn't nothing. The next morning, we found a smoldering log placed neatly beside our fire pit. The fire had been extinguished, but we hadn't touched it. Lily looked at me with wide eyes, but I tried to stay calm. "Maybe it was the wind," I said, though I didn't believe it myself. That night, things got worse. Around midnight, I woke up to faint whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the words were clear. Leave, not safe. My blood ran cold. I shook Lily awake and told her to stay close to me. The whisper stopped, replaced by heavy footsteps circling the tent. I held my breath, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. When the sun finally rose, we packed up and left in a hurry. As we drove away, Lily suddenly gasped. "Dad, look," she said, pointing to the tree line. Standing there was a tall, shadowy figure, its hollow eyes watching us. I don't know what it was, but its presence felt like a warning. I haven't gone camping since, and I don't think I... The road leading to St. Peter's Convent was narrow and winding, flanked by gnarled trees that clawed at the sky. My car bumped along the uneven path. The gray clouds above swirling ominously. When the convent finally came into view, I was struck by its grim majesty. The towering stone walls, now crumbling with age, loomed like a monument to forgotten sins. Vines twisted along the structure, and broken stained glass windows glinted faintly in the dim light. I parked near the rusted iron gate, which creaked loudly as I pushed it open. The overgrown grass whispered against my boots, and the wind carried a faint chill. I pulled my camera and recorder from my bag, steeling myself as I stepped toward the entrance. For a moment, I hesitated, glancing back at the road. It was as though the shadows of the trees were stretching toward me, urging me to leave. I was greeted at the entrance by the Reverend Mother and Sister Agnes.
How was your journey, dear?
The Reverend Mother told me that nobody lived in the convent anymore, due to strange occurrences and the dilapidation of the building. She told me that all nuns depart from the premises before sunset, and that all special ceremonies were held in the mornings only. After I stopped my recorder, the Reverend Mother asked me,
Are you a man of faith, my dear? I will be praying for you.
The nuns left keys to the convent on a desk and said they had opened all the doors. Sister Agnes looked pale and frightened. Inside, the air was heavy, thick with the scent of mildew and decay. Dust coated every surface, and the faint echoes of my footsteps seemed to stretch on endlessly. The walls were lined with faded tapestries, scenes of saints and martyrs, their faces twisted and distorted by time. A shattered crucifix lay on the ground, its wooden frame splintered. I took slow, deliberate steps, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. A sense of unease settled over me. The silence wasn't empty. It felt alive. I reached the main hall, where long wooden pews stretched out like forgotten sentinels. As I approached the altar, my heart skipped a beat. For just a moment, I thought I saw a figure kneeling in prayer, but the shadows swallowed it before I could focus. A faint sound broke the silence, a soft, rhythmic tapping. I followed it to a side corridor where a single candle flickered in an iron sconce. The tapping grew louder as I approached a locked door at the end of the hallway. When I pressed my ear against it, a voice whispered, "Turn back." The door suddenly rattled violently and I stumbled back, my heart racing. I reached the chapel, where a beam of faint light illuminated the altar. The air grew colder as I approached. My eyes were drawn to the loose stone near the altar, a corner jutting slightly upward. As I crouched to investigate, a sudden chill swept through me, and I heard a faint whisper. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Turning slowly, I saw her, the black nun. She stood at the far end of the chapel, her tattered habit billowing unnaturally. Her face was shrouded in shadow, but her glowing red eyes burned into me. I stumbled back, barely managing to hold my flashlight steady. When I blinked, she was gone. Shaken but determined, I pried the loose stone free. Beneath it lay a shallow grave. The bones were wrapped in decayed black fabric, and beside them lay a tarnished crucifix. Scratched into the stone above the grave were the words, "Forgive me." My hands trembled as I reached for my recorder, trying to document the find. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed behind me. I turned sharply, but the chapel was empty. The air felt heavier now, and a low hum resonated through the walls. Gathering my courage, I took the crucifix and hurried out of the chapel. In one of the convent's abandoned rooms, I found a small leather-bound diary tucked beneath a pile of debris. The pages were fragile, filled with anguished confessions. The nun wrote of her affair with a visiting nobleman, her guilt consuming her. She described the day the other nuns discovered her secret, the betrayal, the punishment. The final entry ended abruptly.
They are coming for me, God forgive them.
Deeper in the convent, I stumbled upon a hidden door. Beyond it lay a small, suffocating room. At its center was an altar carved from blackened stone. The symbols etched into its surface seemed to writhe in the flickering light. A blood-stained crucifix leaned against the altar, and the air smelled of iron and ash. As I stepped closer, I felt the weight of the room pressing down on me. The walls seemed to breathe, and the shadows writhed like living things. I placed the crucifix from the grave on the altar, and the room erupted with sound. A guttural chant echoed around me, growing louder and louder. The black nun appeared before the altar, her skeletal hands reaching out. Her face shifted between human and monstrous, her hollow eyes burning with fury. Her voice boomed in my mind, accusing me, condemning me for disturbing her rest. I held up the crucifix from the grave, shouting the words from the diary. God, forgive them! The nun's scream pierced the air and the walls began to tremble. Shadows erupted from the corners of the room, swirling violently as she lunged toward me. I bolted from the room, the walls of the convent groaning as if alive. The shadows pursued me, clawing at my legs and arms. I burst through the front doors, collapsing onto the overgrown grass outside. When I looked back, the convent seemed to shudder before falling silent. Back home, I reviewed my recordings. In the final moments, a faint whisper emerged.
Thank you.
But as I turned off the recorder, I caught sight of my reflection in the mirror, the black nun standing just behind me.
Some sins refuse to be buried.
Sean's invitation. When I first saw the ad, it felt like fate. My hands trembled as I read the headline, Sean Moreno, legendary producer, seeks fresh new talent. I dreamed of an opportunity like this for years. To have a record company finally want to sign me was what I had dreamt of since I was a little girl. The invitation to his mansion for a weekend of mentorship was more than I could have hoped for. The drive to the mansion was uneventful at first, but as I got closer, the road narrowed, swallowed by gnarled trees. The GPS lost signal halfway there, leaving me to navigate winding paths bathed in an eerie mist. By the time I pulled into the circular driveway, the sight of exotic cars parked outside gave me a strange sense of unease, a stark contrast to the mansion's ominous silhouette. Sean himself greeted me at the massive double doors. He was charming and confident, his amber eyes locking onto mine with unsettling intensity. "Welcome, Emma." His handshake was firm, his hands cool and smooth. He led me inside, where a sweeping staircase and glittering chandeliers welcomed me. It was opulent, luxurious beyond anything I'd imagined, but something about it felt wrong. As Sean showed me to my room, a tall, gaunt man appeared silently beside us. His icy blue eyes seemed to pierce straight through me. "This is Mr. Alaric, my butler," Sean said. "He'll make sure you're comfortable." Mr. Alaric inclined his head ever so slightly, but his gaze didn't waver. Something about his presence made my stomach churn. In the dining room later that evening, I met the other guests, 4 other young musicians, all as starstruck as I was. But as the conversation flowed, I noticed how strange they were. Their voices were hollow, and they rarely made eye contact. They didn't even touch their food, which looked unnaturally perfect, like something out of a painting. One of them whispered to me, "Have you noticed? The mirrors don't show everything." Her words sent a shiver down my spine, but before I could ask her what she meant, Sean stood, drawing everyone's attention back to him. The next night, Sean brought me to his recording studio. My eyes caught as I entered. A grand piano sat in the center of the room, surrounded by shelves of books and strange artifacts. "Go ahead," Sean said. "Let me hear that voice." I sang. At first I was nervous, but soon something took over me and I lost myself in the music. When I finished, Sean stood still, his face unreadable. "Your voice is extraordinary." I blushed, unsure how to respond. "We're going to make some real magic, Emma," he said. That night, I woke to faint music echoing through the halls. At first, I thought someone was playing the piano, but the melody was wrong, discordant, eerie. I followed the sound to a locked door. From the other side, I heard whispers, my name. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run. When I turned back, I thought I saw a shadow move at the end of the hall, but it was gone when I blinked. The next morning, I told myself it had been a dream, but Clara's words about the mirrors lingered in my mind. That afternoon, I tested it, standing before the large mirror in my room. At first, my reflection seemed normal, but as I leaned closer, I saw it. My reflection moved out of sync, lingering just a second longer than I did. I stumbled back, my heart racing. On the second evening, Sean presented me with a gown, burgundy silk with gold accents. It was beautiful, but as I slipped it on, I felt trapped, like I was wearing someone else's skin. At dinner, the other guests seemed even stranger, their movements stiff, their expressions blank. When I looked at Sean, his gaze felt predatory. "I'm not feeling well." "Excuse me," I said. Disoriented and confused, I called my Nana, told her the whole story and how I felt sick. Nana reassured me that I was just having cold feet and that I would be all right. Then she asked me, "What was that name again?" What she said next sent shivers down my spine. She said, "Honey, Sean Moreno and Alaric Green, his deputy CEO, died in a fire at a mansion over 50 years ago." I felt chills run down my spine and goosebumps all over me, and then my phone glitched out and the previously full battery was now dead. As I wandered the halls, I saw Mr. Alaric disappear through a hidden door behind a bookshelf. Curiosity got the better of me, and I followed. The passage led to an underground chamber. Candles flickered, illuminating grotesque carvings and paintings on the wall. I lost all sense of time and reality. My sister, who had been dead for 10 years, appeared in a painting and screamed, "Emma, what are you doing here?" Oh no, they're gonna trap your soul as well. At this point, I could no longer tell what was real or what was in my head. I found myself coming to my senses on a cold table. I looked up and saw Sean. In the center of the room, he stood before an altar, wearing a hooded robe, the medallion around his neck glowing faintly. The other guests had formed a circle. They were all dressed in hoods as well. One of the musicians lay unconscious in a pentagram circle on the floor, with candles at the 5 points. I hoped they didn't notice I was awake, so I quickly tried to escape. In a panic, I knocked over a vase, which fell to the floor and broke, alerting everyone. Sean shouted, "There is nothing to fear, let me explain everything," his voice calm and steady. His success, his fame, it all came at a price. The medallion was the key to an ancient ritual that allowed him to steal the voices and souls of young artists, trapping them forever within the mansion. In exchange, the musicians would be allowed to have 2 years of fame and fortune. "You'll be part of something eternal, Emma," Sean said. "You will be part of a powerful club, and you can get out anytime you want by offering 7 souls for yours." I nodded, pretending to accept, but inside I was terrified and panicking. I had to escape. I was up next for an initiation into the occult. That night, I scoured the mansion desperately for answers. In the studio, I found an ancient book detailing the ritual. The medallion was the source of Sean's power. Destroying it would free the trapped souls. But as I read, I felt something cold brush against my neck. I turned and saw my reflection in the studio window, staring back at me, smiling even though I wasn't. I am not a religious person, but right then I said a prayer. "Whoever is listening up there, please let me make it out of this." Alaric led me to the circle. During the ritual, as Sean chanted in a language I couldn't understand, I lunged for the medallion. He was faster than I expected, grabbing my wrist with inhuman strength. Mr. Alaric appeared, his face twisted into a sneer. But as Sean focused on restraining me, I managed to grab the medallion. The eye in the middle of the medallion immediately came to life and looked at me. In a rush of adrenaline, I threw it and it smashed against the altar. The room shook violently. Sean's face looked contorted, like there were 1,000 beings within him. He dropped to his knees, and his real form manifested. Sean let out an ear-piercing scream as the medallion shattered. The walls of the mansion began to bleed, the trapped souls wailing as they were released. I ran, dodging collapsing beams and flames as the mansion fell apart. The forest outside seemed alive, clawing at me as I sprinted toward the driveway. Behind me, the mansion crumbled into ash. The next morning, I returned with the police, but the mansion was gone. Only a charred patch of earth remained. Among the ashes, I found a shard of the medallion still faintly glowing. As I picked it up, I heard a whisper.
Emma, don't worry, you belong to us. We will get you next time.
That's when it dawned on me. Sometimes the price we pay for fame and fortune is too much.